Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and on behalf of the Dean and Chapter, welcome to Liverpool Cathedral. My name is Canon Mike, the organiser of these lectures, and it's a delight to welcome you here to this second in-person Gilbert Scott Science and Faith Lecture for this year. And after nearly 3 years of doing so, we are glad that you have made it here tonight. So as a reminder, the lecture series is entitled in honour not of the famous Giles Gilbert Scott, but his brother, Dr. Sebastian Gilbert Scott, who was a nationally and internationally renowned physician and radiologist in London. We started a series in 2019, which marked the 140th anniversary of his birth in Hampstead in London in 1879. His obituaries in the British Journal of Radiology and the British Medical Journal highlight his many clinical accomplishments, but also how good a teacher he was, teaching by example through a kindly, cheerful, and optimistic manner with his patients to many a young trainee radiologist. Our series is therefore designed so we have speakers who share their thoughts and experiences in much the same way. This is the third set of lectures we've had, and we have a specific page on our website which now details the past lectures and is the place for announcements for future lectures too. It also has links to recordings of the lectures where they are available. The QR code and the link on your information sheets on your seats can guide you there, so please do take a look. You'll see how the series has grown over the years, now being a mixture of online and in-person lectures, which happen throughout the year. As you know, these lectures are always completely free, reflecting the welcome and encounter here at Liverpool. But there are always costs to cover in holding these evenings. So please may I ask you to consider a donation if you can in the baskets at the end of the lecture. Thank you for all your previous generous donations. Finally, before we get on with a really interesting part of this evening, you should also find short evaluation sheets on your chairs. Please do consider filling this in for tonight's lecture and perhaps for our series as a whole, so we can get your valuable thoughts and feedback. And so without further delay, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Elaine Howard-Ecklund, speaking to us from Rice University in Houston in Texas. And Professor Ecklund is the Herbert S. Autrey Chair in Social Sciences, Professor of Sociology, and Director of the Religion and Public Life Program at Rice. It's wonderful to be able to have her speak to us live. Good afternoon, Professor Ecklund. It is the middle of a busy day, I believe, for you. And this is the second time that Professor Ecklund has managed to join us virtually in Liverpool and share some of her excellent research and experiences. She very kindly was part of the panel for our discussion back in February on 21st century particle physics. As you can see from the short biographies on your information sheets, we have another world expert in her field with us tonight, and I would highly recommend both the book, which is the subject of her lecture for us tonight, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, and her follow-on to that, Varieties of Atheism in Science, which can be ordered through our Cathedral bookshop. They reflect the very wide-ranging expert research that Professor Ecklund has conducted both in the US and in the UK. So without further ado, it's an absolute delight to welcome Professor Elaine Howard-Ecklund to our series and our lecture here tonight. Welcome, Professor Ecklund.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. Thank you. I only wish that I could be at the Liverpool Cathedral in person. I am hoping to visit at some point. It would be a great privilege to be with you in person, but it's my hope that doing this online will mean that more people can join us virtually. So for the past 15 years, I have been studying what scientists think about religion and what religious people think about science. As part of that work, I have surveyed nearly 40,000 scientists, and my team and I have completed over 1,000 in-depth interviews with some of them in their offices and laboratories about what they think about faith. I have also surveyed, mainly in the United States, members of the American public, including evangelical Christians, Muslims, Presbyterians, and those from many other traditions, as well as those who have no religion at all, in terms of what they think about science. But I wrote Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear, specifically for the Christian community. And I feel a motivation as a practicing Christian myself to try and make sure and translate my research whenever I can to those particular communities. And this evening, I want to talk about 3 key insights and 4 of the shared values that I talk about in the book, Between Science and Faith, 4 of the shared values between science and faith. So here's the first key insight. I don't know if you're taking notes or not, but I'll try to help you along if you are by providing some numeric outline. So the first key insight is this: when it comes to science and faith, there is a fine line between fear and anger. Let's get personal. Here's my own story that illustrates the line between fear and anger. I could tell you right away if you asked me when in my life I had been the most afraid. It was when my daughter was 3 years old and I was picking her up from childcare. And that day I was tired from work. I was parenting solo. She begged to stay a few more minutes and play with her friends, and I acquiesced. The little children started a game of hide and seek. There was a set of bushes right outside the child care center where, they were kind of playing around there. And I turned away for a minute to talk with another parent, and daylight was starting to fade away. And I expected, of course, that at any moment she would sidle up to me and wrap her arms around my leg and ask if we could go home. But after a few minutes, when that didn't happen, I started to look around and I yelled, "It's time to go." And I called out, I called her name, no response. One by one, the parents and children got into their cars. They drove away. I called out again, this time with a little bit more urgency, and I picked up my work bag and I walked over to where she and her friends were playing hide and seek, and I didn't see anyone. Those of you in the audience who are parents will immediately identify. At that point, my heart's starting to race. I'm starting to get a little bit of manifestation of panic. I check up and down the street. I thought maybe because she was a toddler that she had perhaps opened up the doors of one of the cars and gotten in. So I actually started going physically to people's cars and opening up the doors. And a man came out of one of the houses near the child care center and actually asked me if I was trying to break into his car. I quickly commissioned him in the search. I was yelling out her name. This went on for about 10 minutes. The daycare center provider at that point had come out of her office, and she said that if we didn't find my daughter in a couple of minutes, she was going to need to activate the safety protocol for a missing child. She said, in 3 minutes, I'm going to need to call the police, and I'm going to need to get a search party here. Then I noticed a little boy come up to me and tap me on the leg. And he said he knew where my daughter was. He said that she was breathing in the bushes. The bottom line is this: the entire time I was searching, she had been hiding about 10 feet in front of me. She'd heard me, she'd heard the associate director, she'd heard my friends and others who were helping in the search, all of us calling to her, and yet she had chosen not to answer. The first thing I did after she was found is I picked her up and I hugged her so hard that she asked me to loosen my grip. And then I put her down on the ground and I yelled at her and I said, "I'm so angry, I want to give you such a spanking." The director of the daycare, the one who'd called the safety protocol, gently touched my arm and, perhaps not wanting to witness what might happen next, said, "Let's take a step back. There is a fine line between fear and anger. There is a fine line between fear and anger." I try to bring this lesson to my academic work on how religious people view science and scientists, and how scientists view religion and religious people. Sometimes fear can masquerade as anger, leading to conflict. So when we see conflict between religious communities and scientific communities, for example, we should examine whether there actually might be underlying fear and try to understand it. This brings me to my second key insight. Sociologists like myself, who study group behaviors, and social scientists more broadly, I think bring something special to the intersection between faith and science. We are interested in understanding how groups have an impact on individuals and how groups can bring changes to society. One way we study this is by listening to people's life stories and analyzing to what extent these individual stories are representative of the groups we as individuals are part of. Therefore, sociological data helps us get past the loudest and most combative voices that drive public debate often, and help us gain a more nuanced and accurate picture of what people think, value, and believe. Sociology does not have the same tools as philosophy or theology. It cannot tell us the right way to live. But if we know how we want our communities or churches or laboratories to be different, then sociological tools can, under certain conditions, help us change group cultures and engage in practices that help us effect change. And when it comes to understanding the intersection between religion and science, sociology provides a key kind of insight. Science and religion are not just sets of ideas or thought systems, although they are indeed those things. Science and religion are communities of people, communities like laboratories and churches and universities and denominations. And some people, of course, are part of both communities. Here is another insight, my third insight. Science and faith share core values. So communities of scientists, communities of people of faith, I want to argue, share core values that could bring these communities together to work for the common good. And the global push to address the pandemic that we have all been experiencing, to address the pandemic medically and to heal its collateral damage socially and spiritually, collateral damage that is having an unequal impact on particular groups and communities, I want to argue really requires both religious and scientific communities working together at top capacity. I want to turn now to discussing 4 values out of the 8 discussed in my book, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, values that I think can lead us beyond fear to a sense of collaboration. The first value is curiosity. You remember some conversations for the rest of your life. I interviewed Jill for my first study 15 years ago now of how scientists view religion. Jill was already at the top of her field. She was a biologist leading a successful laboratory at an elite research university. She was one of the only women in her institution at her level, and one of the less than 10% of women in her particular field of science. As I walked toward her office in her famous university, I noticed her door had a sign of the Darwin fish eating the Christian fish, the Ecklund symbol. I was conducting my first study on scientists' attitudes towards faith, and the sign, quite frankly, made me a little bit nervous. I remember knocking kind of tentatively and thinking to myself that it would be okay with me actually if Jill had forgotten her appointment for our interview, but she came to the door right away. Jill did nothing to put me at ease. She didn't greet me with a handshake or a smile. She just curtly asked me to come in and directed me to sit on a metal chair across the desk from her. She told me that she had nothing to say about science and faith, I wrote in my field notes after this interview that I couldn't remember if the air conditioning in her office was on full blast or if I just felt cold because of the kind of chilly social atmosphere. My first question to Jill was if she practiced a religion or considered herself a person of faith. And she said, no, I'm simply an atheist. I then asked her whether she had been raised in a faith tradition. It was the type of question that could have been answered yes or no. I was taken aback when Jill looked away from me and her eyes began to fill with tears. In the years since then, as I told you earlier, I have interviewed over 1,000 scientists about their views on faith. And Jill is still the only one I have interviewed who has cried during the interview. As her tears welled up, my own feelings turned from apprehension to compassion. I also became curious about why the question about her faith background elicited such emotion. Jill told me she came from a Christian family, and as a child, she has spent a lot of time at church. Raised in a rural community, Jill also spent a lot of time outdoors, and she began to see the beauty in nature and to develop a real love of the natural world. She spent a lot of time in her schoolwork too. She particularly loved her biology and chemistry classes. She was a total geek, she said, and her grades were fantabulous in her word. But as she became more curious about the natural world, Jill also became concerned about certain aspects of her faith. She brought questions about the origin and development of life on earth and the role of God in creation to her parents and her pastors. At that point, Jill did not know she would go into science. She was simply an inquisitive kid following and feeding her natural curiosity. But she told me, and I quote her now, when I asked hard questions, I was told by my pastor and my clergy just to make a decision to believe, to forget about science, she said. It was an answer that did not satisfy Jill. She tried several times to talk with her youth group leaders about the questions that science brought to mind, the kind of questions she had for her faith, but she was constantly told not to explore so much. I feel like religion was a mechanism by which judgment was passed on people who were different, she recounted. And for me, in my personal history in childhood, it was judgment, and it really did not work out so well for me. By the time Jill was in her teens, she had left her church. Excuse me. How do we nurture curiosity in church communities and in scientific communities as an antidote to fear? As a character trait, the philosopher Elias Baumgarten writes, curiosity is a disposition to want to know, to want to learn about a wide variety of things. The more one has this character trait, the more often or the more intensely one will, on particular occasions, experience a desire or urge to investigate and learn more about something. But in our current culture, the word curious can seem small and even weak. It brings to mind a child wondering what is around the corner before she takes a look. Our culture seems to prefer stronger words like expert, like leader, like winner. But we need to value more highly in our society the ability to ask questions that help us better understand both others and ourselves, and that help us lead better lives. Let's ask different questions. When you happen upon someone you disagree with, let curiosity replace anger and fear. Ask why. Curiosity is a show of strength, I would argue, a yearning to push the boundaries of knowledge. Scientists like Jill are often known for their curiosity. For example, the string theorist Sylvester James Gates Jr., who's the first Black American to have an endowed chair in physics at a major US research university and is currently president of the American Physical Society, speaks about the relationship between science and religion. Gates says that he got used to being curious, to asking hard questions at an early age. And he said he once remembers asking his dad Dad, do you remember me as a kid asking all kinds of questions? And his dad said to him, yes, I remember. And Gates said, it always seemed to me like you had answers for everything. And his dad said something like, I didn't have the answers. What I was interested in was you asking the right questions. And if I didn't have an answer immediately, I would tell you to hold off. I would go and get some resource, and the next day or so, I'd come back and answer your question. My research shows that many Christians are curious about the relationship between science and faith and how they can integrate science with their Christian faith. This curiosity can sometimes be painful and stressful. Christian communities, though, I think can become safe places for nurturing curiosity, especially those who are curious about science and faith. The most valuable resource in the Christian community is perhaps those who have personal experience and accomplishment, the fellow Christians who've successfully done it before them. Churches need, I think, to become places that offer the reward of nurturing and satisfying curiosity about science. The second shared value I want to talk about tonight is humility. I have been humbled. If you had asked me when I first started my research whether there are many ways of being a religious scientist, I would have said, of course. But if you'd asked me whether there are many ways of being an atheist scientist, I probably would have said not really. Being an atheist of any sort is by definition not to believe in God. Simple as that. I was so sure I was right. But as a sociologist, I have learned to doubt my assumptions, especially the assumptions I have about characteristics of groups. My studies of scientists over the past 15 years have shown me that there are indeed varieties of atheism among scientists. And with David Johnson, I have just written a book that came out last year called Varieties of Atheism Among Scientists. Like a true academic, when I make a discovery, I write a book about it. This is just one of the ways that my research has really humbled me and changed my previous thinking about a topic. Humility is recognizing limitations in our own understandings, abilities, and perspectives. From a Christian standpoint, we ought to be familiar with this. Humility is being aware that God is God and we are not. And that full truth can never fully be known because of our human limitations and our limited ability to know the mind of God. It's not that there is no truth as human beings, but that we do not yet see things clearly, as the pastor and theologian Eugene Peterson translates in his paraphrase of the Holy Bible, The Message. We are squinting in a fog, peering through a mist. On this earth, we are all extremely constrained in our limited human knowledge. Humility, especially intellectual humility, is a key scientific virtue. In the study of scientific virtues conducted by philosopher Robert Pennock, he found that humility to evidence, defined as the willingness to abandon a preferred hypothesis when faced with conflicting results, was one of the 10 most widely held values of science as named by elite scientists. And my studies have examined how scientists practice humility in the pursuit of understanding and truth. A few years ago, I read an article by the scientist Amanda King. In it, she describes her experiences as a PhD student. And she said that she experienced in her lab the real practice of humility. She said about 2 hours into a meeting that I remember in particular, a meeting about my research work, I realized that I was the only person in this room without at least one doctoral degree. I don't know who those people are who have 2 degrees, doctoral degrees, but one was enough for me. She goes on to write, so why were those folks who had their doctorates or even 2 doctorates treating me with such unearned respect? And she goes on to credit their humility in this way. King says, humility does not mean meekness. Humility does not mean unconditional deference. Humility does not mean not standing up for what you believe in. Humility means being open to the possibility of being wrong, being willing to consider other people's ideas, and being respectful of your peers, your subordinates, your seniors. From my own studies and experiences in science, I too have seen that intellectual humility and relational humility, embodying kindness and respect for the ideas of others, no matter their status, go hand in hand. When we recognize that we are limited in our own understanding, abilities, and perspectives, I think we have the capacity to display humility and be kind about the limitations of others. And we have a deep sense that we can learn, that we have something to learn from every person. I've also noticed that practicing relational humility is not always easy for scientists, myself included. Science can be an extremely competitive environment. That is, one scientist that I interviewed told me, science often seems to chew up and spit out individuals with little regard for human dignity. Scientists often work incredibly long hours with no guarantee of payoff. Often we get so caught up in our careers that we can forget the community of people that we are engaging with every day and who deserve to be treated with respect and who we have responsibility for. We can also become too concerned with institutional status and prestige. Yet I've also found that many scientists place great importance on practicing relational humility in the workplace. Many of the about 20% of university scientists who are Christians that I spoke with told me that caring for those they work with and mentor is extremely important to them in their own sense of things. They often said it's important to ensure that those around them are being treated with care and respect. And I don't mean to communicate here that those who do not practice the Christian faith are not treating their students with care and respect, but just this is how Christians understand their practice of relational humility. One Christian biologist recounted how he tried to use humility to shift the organizational culture of his scientific work environment. He said he wanted to make sure that there's greater awareness that science is more than just a set of ideas and methods. It's more than just a career. It's more than just a method. It's a community of people that Jesus loves. Another scientist explained how her moral commitments as a Christian influence how she treats others, explaining that regardless of their rank or background, she tries to treat people with a sense of equality. She explained, as a Christian, that's very motivating to me. I believe that people are equal and that everyone has the potential for good that makes them, and that they are intrinsically valued, which is very much a part of my Christian beliefs. The third shared value is shalom. Shalom is a Hebrew word that comes from a root that means completeness and perfection. And it is the peace, harmony, well-being, and prosperity that results from the flourishing of all creation. I want to acknowledge that it is really hard to appreciate shalom in these times, really hard. Back when I worked on campus rather than at home, as I have been often in the past 2 years, I walked to school and I wrote a prayer that was based on the Psalm 46, that some of you know, I'm sure, be still and know that I am God. And I would repeat that phrase, let me be still and know that you are God, to myself as I walked on the university campus. As I got near to the campus, I would try to suppress that urge I know that many of us have, to start listing the litany of things that I needed to do. Let me be still. I would wait for the light in front of the campus to turn green and stand on one foot and then the other, trying to get in a few balance exercise for fitness in. I'm very easily distracted. And I would then repeat that phrase, let me be still. Once I'm on my university campus, there is a beautiful entrance with ornate architecture, and my walk takes me through a building-size art installation, which has a square in the top that's open to the sky. When I remember, I would stop there and look through the square It's here that I would turn to the second part of the prayer. Let me know that I am fully loved by God. I pray this piece of the prayer often because I often feel that there are so many people to impress as part of my work. They might be colleagues, students, funders, reviewers, just to name a few. The culture of academia is often pressure-filled, highly competitive. I am at once both preoccupied with my limits and yet not aware enough of my limits. Let me know that I am fully loved, that I have been created with everything I need in order to do what I need to do. The last part of my walk takes me up several flights of stairs, and with each step, I repeat the third part of my prayer, which is, let me enter into what you are already doing today, which helps me realize that we do not create our own opportunities, that there are opportunities that God has put before us that we walk into. When I arrive at my office in the earliest times before the sun fully rises, I'm often excited to be there. I take joy in my work. I see my work definitely as having a higher purpose, and I know that I'm incredibly fortunate to do work that has such purpose. On the not so good days, I fall prey to what I call the hustle. I often consider skipping the walk to get to work faster in my car, saving about 5 minutes. I'm not sure what I think I'm going to do with those 5 extra minutes. I need to be completely reminded of that sense of shalom, of really seeking the wholeness and completeness of the world. My work is not fractured. I don't work solely for myself, and my duty needs to be beyond the self. I work with and for the others I collaborate with. I work with the students and for the students I mentor and teach. I work for the public outside the university. It's my hope that I work from a place of community-based virtues like equality and justice. I feel a responsibility to use my scientific work to accomplish something meaningful, to improve social problems, and to help people flourish. In my interviews with scientists of faith, both those who are Christians and those of other faith traditions, sometimes they connect their faith traditions in similar ways to their work and to their goals, sometimes drawing on the concepts of shalom and the twin concept of stewardship. I think it's important to remember that shalom cannot be pretended. In its best sense, it means to get involved in the messiness of the world, to try to mix it up with structures that are not just to make them more just. The theologian Walter Brueggemann writes in The Prophetic Imagination, Jesus and his solidarity with the marginal ones is moved to compassion. Compassion constitutes a radical form of criticism, for it announces that the hurt is to be taken seriously, that the hurt is not to be accepted as normal and natural, but as abnormal and unacceptable condition for humanness. Thus, the compassion of Jesus is not to be understood as a personal, emotional reaction, but as a public criticism in which he dares to act upon his concern against this entire numbness of the social context. Several scientists who are Christians I interviewed explicitly discussed increasing gender and race representation in science as one of their goals and one of the ways they enter into Shalom through their work as scientists. Some of these scientists specifically connect their faith to their efforts to increase opportunities for those who might be underrepresented in science and not have access to science careers. To give you a little background, when we look at just in the US, where I'm from, in the US scientific community, although I do suspect from other research that the situation is somewhat similar in the UK, when we look at the US scientific community, we see that non-white people, but especially US Black and Hispanic Americans and US born Asian Americans even are vastly underrepresented in science. For example, Black Americans, who comprise about 13 to 15% of the US population as a whole, make up less than 1% of all those who have careers in science, medicine, and technology. And women of all ethnic and racial groups are also underrepresented in much of science, representing less than 10% in many scientific fields. And yet, non-white people and women are all overrepresented in church communities. Nearly 77% of Hispanics see themselves as Catholic, Protestant, or evangelical Christians, for example. A related problem is that Christians from underrepresented minority groups don't often hear about scientists who believe like them or see scientists who look like them. So they face what I've called in my broader work a sort of double or triple marginality, both as an underrepresented racial group, perhaps an underrepresented gender group, and an unrepresented religious group in the sciences. One Christian geneticist I interviewed, who's one of the few Black women in her field at an elite university, was the first woman and the first Black American to become head of a genetics program. During 5 years she spent as a student, she said there was only one Black speaker brought in for her department's weekly seminar. For a lot of African Americans, science is a no trespassing zone, one Black pastor I interviewed said. He said, a Hispanic pastor told me, I think it's helpful to have somebody of your own skin color and your own faith in science, because to see one of your own would give an inspiration. Representation matters, and the lack of representation of women and underrepresented minorities in science is an issue that ought to concern churches. Science needs more diversity, and Christians have a responsibility to be concerned about that lack of diversity and the injustices that cause it as a part of seeking shalom. Those who have been and are most marginalized in our society often are deeply compelled to fight structures and engage in efforts that demarginalize others. And the science career can be used, I think, to care for people in the interest of justice and equity and human flourishing, both for people and for the world that we inhabit. I want to end by touching on a fourth value, which is gratitude. And I think especially important for addressing the fears that people have of one another right now. It's very hard to be afraid of someone that you are grateful for. Through my studies and my personal experiences, I found that the experience of gratitude, as I've said, is really wholly antithetical to anger and to fear, emotions some Christians feel towards scientific findings and scientists, and quite frankly, that some scientists feel towards all religion, not just Christianity, and religious people. One pastor told me this. He said, "What is so unique in the Black church tradition that I work in is that it is a theology rooted in gratitude rather than suspicion, which is a very different posture for addressing whatever life issues come your way. It separates, for example, how you would approach science or a scientist, or how you would approach theological questions, whether God is good. The theology already accepted that God is good." According to the writer Diana Butler Bass, who's I think written a very good book on gratitude, she says, "Gratitude is not about having things. Gratitude is the emotional response to the surprise of our very existence, to sensing that inner light and realizing the astonishing sacred, social, and scientific events that brought each of us into being and that allow us to value each person, that allow us to cry out like the poets from the Christian tradition, 'I am fearfully and wonderfully made.'" Thank you so much. I think I'll stop there, and we can open it up for questions now.